هيدر هيدر عم الآخر هيدر.
All right, alhamdulillah, we've reached our first day of class, and last class what we went over was just a basic overview of how this course will run. All the information about that is on the syllabus. But last class, I think the more important thing that we talked about was the 2 units of this class. So the main 2 topics that we're going to talk about in introductory logic are 2. We're going to learn how to define things, and then we're going to learn how to argue things based on those definitions. Because these 2 are the most fundamental parts of logic. From these 2, you can't have any logic, right? You need to learn what you're arguing in the first place, because you need to understand what things are. And then before you argue something in the first place, you need to understand what you're arguing. So you have to understand what those whats are. So in today's class, we're going to be talking about the very, very basic introduction, first steps to those 2 units. I'm going to mention the argumentation part of the class briefly during this lesson, but I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'm only doing it just so I can introduce the first concept a little bit better. That being said, we're going to be talking about 2 concepts, apprehension and affirmation. And I'll explain what these 2 mean as we go along. But first, I want to give up an example. So what happens when you go outside and you see a tree, right? What are the steps involved to you understanding that thing is a tree? So when you go outside and you look around, your senses pick up on information. There's just a bunch of stuff that's everywhere. You see a bunch of things, there's a bunch of discrete shapes and sounds and colors and sights. And then your brain is able to differentiate between these packets of information. So what do I mean by that, right? So you're going on the street and you see a sign, you see a stop sign. How does your brain know whether that stop sign isn't just part of the grass or not? It's because your brain is able to differentiate between the grass and the stop sign oftentimes without even consciously perceiving it. This process by which you differentiate a thing from other things is called apprehension. Apprehension essentially means to capture the essence of something. So what do I mean by that? It means to capture and to understand the whatness of a thing. So for example, if I were to apprehend a desk, I need to understand the concept of a desk in my head in the first place, right? I need to understand what makes a desk a desk. And I need to understand what makes this desk not a chair, not the floor, not a bed. This is what apprehension is. It's essentially just being able to differentiate a thing from its surroundings. So that being said, there are 2 kinds of apprehension. There are simple apprehensions and there are difficult apprehensions. So simple are immediate and self-evident. So for example, the color red. I don't need to define what the color red is. I just know that it's the color red, and I can differentiate it from the color blue or green or yellow or white, and I can differentiate it between these 2 colors. But on the other hand, if I said table and chair, these are more difficult apprehensions, meaning they need to be defined in order for me to differentiate them from each other. Because, for example, a table can look like a chair and a chair can look like a table. An ottoman can be both a chair and a table, but we need to define what those things are in order to be able to differentiate them. So the goal of logic here is to be able to take these simple apprehensions, like red or hard, or you hear a dog? Okay, I guess that's you. Anyways, so the goal here is to take simple apprehensions like red or tall or hard or metal and form them into more concrete definitions to make difficult apprehensions possible. So back to our tree example, right? You go outside and you see a bunch of stuff, and then your brain manages to take all that stuff and differentiate it into different things. So your brain is able to categorize and understand that there are different kinds of things. So it'll categorize that all of these things look like trees. But before you understand that they look like trees, your brain first categorizes them as things that it doesn't know yet. And then what happens is your brain goes into your head and it looks for the concept of a tree. And then it looks outside and it says, is this matching what's in my head? So your head has a concept of a tree, and you look outside and you see a thing, and then your brain asks, is this a tree? And it says yes. This happens subconsciously. And oftentimes we can't necessarily pinpoint it, but 99% of the time we don't need to ask ourselves, is this a tree? Because our brain is able to do it for us. But this is important because when we're having more complicated discussions, we need to be able to understand what concepts we're discussing before we go into our minds and pull it out and match it to what we're discussing. So this is very important to be able to understand not only at the simple level, but also at the difficult level. So the process by which your brain takes the concept in your head and matches it to what you're seeing out in the open is called affirmation. So when your brain asks, is this a tree? The answer is either true or false. So if I look out and I see a thing that's made out of wood, it has leaves, it has branches, and the concept in my brain matches what I see, it says this is a tree. True. Now, affirmation can also be of two kinds. Affirmation can be of simple or difficult. So for example, if I said the sky is blue, that's a simple affirmation. How do I know it's simple? Well, here's the thing. I don't need to argue that the sky is blue. I just know that the sky is blue because I understand the concept of sky, and I understand the concept of blue, and I understand that the sky is blue. There's no argumentation required for simple affirmation. Whereas for difficult affirmation, you need to prove it. So for example, if I said the inverse square of the pressure is like related to heat or something, I need to be able to prove that. That's a difficult affirmation. Or if I said that raising taxes causes blank in the economy, I need to prove that through difficult affirmation. So let's go over what we just learned. What we just learned is there are two things. There's apprehension and there's affirmation. Apprehension is to understand what a thing is, and affirmation is to assign something to that what. So what do I mean? Affirmation is essentially just saying, is this blank? Or to assign some true or false yes or no question to everything. So now, let me ask you real quick. Did everyone follow that so far? Or should I explain it a little bit better? Okay. Everyone else? Okay. So the goal of logic is to be able to move from simple apprehensions to create simple affirmations. So for example, if I wanted to argue a very complicated point, I have to start from the very, very basics of, like, for example, the sky is blue, water is blue, therefore the light passes through our eyes must be the same, right? I have to start with simple concepts first, and I have to build up to more difficult concepts. So the goal of logic essentially is to take these simple ideas and build up to more complicated ones. Now, what has happened when you have pulled the concept of a tree? So going back to our tree example, so what have you done so far? First of all, you looked out and you see a bunch of stuff. Your brain has differentiated it. And by differentiating it, it has grasped the essence of what those things are. And by grasping the essence of what those things are, it has apprehended the concept of those things. And then your brain goes back and you look back into your memory and you see something that matches what you're conceptualizing by what you're seeing. And you're affirming that, yes, this is a tree. So what's happening when you're pulling the information from the back of your head is you're pulling out something called a universal concept. Now, a universal concept is something that is applicable in any time, in any place, and can be applied to anything. So what do I mean by this? So for example, think of an apple, right? An apple is an apple regardless of whether it's made 10,000 years ago, whether it's in your fridge, in outer space, whether the apple is on the street rotting, or whether the apple is in front of my desk. An apple is an apple. The concept of an apple can be applied anywhere, right? So similarly, for example, the concept of a human being, even you can conceive of the concept of the human being even before human beings were created, right? So for example, you can imagine that a human being existed 5 million years ago, which they didn't, right? But you can still imagine that. That's a universal concept. It's something that you can pull from the back of your head and you can apply it to anything and it'll still remain in its essence. That it won't change depending on what you do to it or how you or what time it's being in or what place it's in. If it changes in what time or place it's in, it's not a universal concept. But if the essence of a thing remains regardless of what you do to it or where you place it or how you operate it, it's going to be the same, then it's a universal concept. Now, on the other hand, there's also partial concepts. Now, what is a partial concept? A partial concept is a universal concept that has been instantiated. So what do I mean by that? So, for example, if I were to say this apple on my desk, when I say this apple, I'm referring to the partial concept of that apple, meaning that it doesn't represent all apples. Whereas if I had the concept of an apple in my mind, I would be able to apply that to everything else in the world. But on the other hand, if I were to say this apple, yeah, you have a question? Sorry, I'm waiting for this question. Okay, all right. So for example, if I were to say, so a partial concept is something that is not applicable everywhere because it exists in reality, right? So universal concepts exist in our head, and these partial concepts exist in reality. They're things that we can point to, and we can say that this is here. But the reason why they're called partial concepts is because they don't represent the whole and the actuality of all apples. They don't represent every single apple in the world. If I were to point to an apple on my desk, it wouldn't be able to represent all of the apples that I can possibly conceive of. Whereas if I had the concept of the apple in my head, all right, good night, Leoroko. Or if I had the concept of the apple in my head, I would be able to apply it to every apple. Does that make sense? Okay. So now that we've built up to this idea of this broken yeses, now that we've built up to this idea of concepts in our head, we can start to play around with them. So what have we done so far again? I'm going to keep going back to this tree example because it's clearer to understand this way, right? So what happens when you go outside, right? What's the first thing that happens? You see things, and then your mind differentiates them. And by differentiating them, it has captured the essence of that thing. And then by capturing the essence of that thing and applying it to the universal concept in your head, you affirm that, yes, this is a tree. Now, next, we can play around with these ideas of universal concepts as they relate to definitions. So now I want everyone to imagine that concepts are like circles, right? So what do I mean? So the concept of an animal, for example, right? The concept of an animal can consist of like cats, horses, dogs, lions, human beings, monkeys. It can consist of a lot of different things. It's a big circle, right? But if I said vertebrates, that is a smaller circle within the animal circle. So if I were to say vertebrate, I'm referring both to a vertebrate, the circle of vertebrates themselves, as well as the circle of animals. So whenever I talk about something that's within the circle, I'm also referring to the concept of that circle as well. What do I mean? So if I were to say Ali is a human being, I'm also implying that Ali is also an animal, right? So concepts are like circles. They encompass a certain number of things and they can encompass a certain characteristic of ideas. That being said, all concepts have four relationships as they relate to each other. What are these four relationships? So I want you to imagine two circles in your head. For the first relationship, it's exact overlap, meaning that the circles are exactly on top of each other. One is not bigger than the other and one is not smaller than the other, and they're in the exact same position. So what's an example of this? So uh, people who do hookah and people who do zanjir matam. That was a bad joke. But yeah, basically, you get what I mean, right? The fact that whatever is encompassed within those two separate concepts refer to the same number and same kinds of things, right? On the other hand, so now that's the first relationship, exact overlap. The second relationship is encompassing. So in the second relationship, one circle is bigger than the second circle. So for example, the bigger circle would be animals, and the smaller circle would be humans. So the concept of animals encompasses the concept of humans. The third relationship is the relationship of the Venn diagram, meaning that some of the members of one circle exist in the other circle, but neither of the circles share a common reality. So, for example, if I were to say Americans and Muslims, there are some Americans who are Muslims, and there are some Muslims who are Americans, but not all Americans are Muslims, and not all Muslims are Americans. But they share groups, they share common species, they share a common grouping of people. And then the fourth relationship is that there's no relationship at all. That there's two circles are completely discrete from each other, and they have zero commonality and zero common reality. For the first two relationships, exact overlap and encompassing. In these two relationships, what essentially happens is that the members share a common essence. So in exact overlap, the members are essentially the same. What do I mean by essentially? I mean by they have the same essence. So essentially, same essence, same word. That was just an aside. But exact overlap, meaning that all of the members share the exact same reality, same essence. Whereas encompassing, meaning that one circle is bigger than the other, but one of them is inside of the other, means that only the members of the smaller circle share the same exact reality as the members of the larger circle. So all humans are animals, but not all animals are humans. But in the third and fourth relationships, the members do not share a common reality, except under perhaps a bigger circle. So for example, Muslims and Americans don't share the same essence. They don't have any sort of essential similarity, except for example, if you put both of those circles in a larger circle of humanity. So Muslims and Americans are both humans, but Muslims and Americans don't share a common essence as they relate to themselves. Does that make sense so far? Did everyone get the idea of the four relationships between concepts? I shall take that as a yes. So, when we're talking about definitions, for example, we can expand or contract these circles in our head. And as we're defining words, we can limit or we can expand these circles to encompass different things. So, what do I mean? So, let's say I'm discussing like crime policy with someone, and someone comes up to me and says something like, so let's say your racist uncle comes up to you and he says like all black people commit crimes, therefore we should put police in their neighborhoods, right? When you're discussing this, you have to be able to what he's done wrong is he's expanded the circle of black people into the circle of crime, and he's taken that entire circle and put it inside. Whereas in reality, it's a Venn diagram relationship, not an encompassing relationship. So when we're discussing things, you have to be able to expand and contract these circles in your head to limit or to exclude or include different ideas within your head. Sorry about that. So yeah, you need to be able to expand or contract the circles to encompass different ideas in your head and to explore different relationships between concepts. Now, obviously, this is all very, very theoretical, very, very conceptual, and I don't blame you if it flies over your head. So I do implore you, please ask some questions if you don't get what's going on, right? If you're a little bit confused or if you're a little bit lost, please ask some questions. So I'm gonna review really quickly as to what we went over for this lesson. It was a short lesson because it wasn't too difficult. I went over lessons 2 and 3, introduction for apprehension and affirmation, and the 4 relationships between universal concepts. So for apprehension is what? To capture the essence of something, to capture the whatness of a thing. Affirmation is to say that something is something and to assign a true or false to it. So for example, the sky is blue, right? So in affirmation, you have to make 2 apprehensions. First, you have to understand the concept of sky, and then you have to understand the concept of blue. And then affirmation is sky is blue, true. That's true. That's affirmation. Now, what's happened is by understanding these 2 concepts of sky and blue, you can come up with a universal concept for either of those 2 things. So you can come up with the concept of blue and you can apply it to everything. So if you could say blue book, blue toothbrush, blue deodorant, blue pillow, blue wall. Whereas if I were to say this blue or this color blue, it would not represent the whole of all of the concept blue. It would only represent an individual member of that concept of blue. Whereas if I were to refer to blue, I would be referring to all of the members. And even if I close that circle down and let's say I was really specific about what that blue was, it would still refer to being a universal concept. And then finally, we went over all universal concepts have 4 relationships with each other. And how do you think of these 4 relationships? These 4 relationships are thought of as 2 circles. So either the 2 circles are exactly the same size and they overlap each other exactly, or one circle is bigger than the other, but one of them is inside of the other. Or the third one is that the 2 circles are like a Venn diagram. And the 4th relationship is that the 2 circles are completely separate from each other. And these circles are referring to concepts in general, like concepts as a whole. And you can expand or contract these when you're defining things in order to be able to understand the definition or essence of a thing better. So with that basically just about concludes tonight's lesson. Thank you guys for attending. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
هيدر هيدر عم الآخر هيدر